Welcome to Embody, the show where we look at living well through mastering body, breath, and mind. Now, of course, mastering is an interesting word because the body is incredible, and the concept of mastery is a strange one. But that aside, we're going to look at how to use the skills, the meta skills of body, breath, and mind to live really well. Now, this episode is looking at stress, and we're going to look at some really good skill sets of what you can do. In the last episode, in this really misunderstood topic, we looked at the crucial differences between environmental stress, developmental stress, and perceptual stress, and why these matter. The differences matter for a start because it helps us to understand why to do what to do to help ourselves. We look briefly at interrupting patterns and rewiring the stress responses with these practices of pattern interruption, which we're going to go into more on this time. And this works because of the brain's ability to rewire itself, something called neuroplasticity. Now, we also looked at eustress, the good stress, the kind of stress that, and there are a few neurotransmitters involved in this. And yes, it's stressful, but it gives us benefit. And the neurotransmitters involved that we talked about were dopamine, which fuels motivation and reward. Serotonin, which is kind of the joy or the happiness chemical, if you like. And there's endorphins and cannabinoids, which bring feelings of bliss. And there's GABA, which calms the nervous system. And then, of course, maybe even DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the psychedelic molecule in deep breathwork states. And again, we'll look at the evidence for this at some point in this journey of podcasts. We also looked at the stress cascade and at adrenaline, the first wave of stress, and at cortisol, the long-term stress hormone, and the effects of this on our system. So if you haven't listened to that, go back and check out the other podcast. It's here on YouTube, so you can find it, dive into it, and get the basic framework of what exactly stress is. And then this one will make even more sense. So we've covered a fair bit of terrain, and we're going to the power topics of discipline, embodiment, and building resilience using breath and mind-based tools. Now, coming from a childhood fairly rich in adversity, and it's taken me decades to learn the power skills of resilience. It really has, and I'm still learning. And I'm going to do my best to communicate some of these with you as we go through this episode. I think if anybody has been through, strong childhood adversity, it's a lifetime's work. So that, you're going to be revisiting those kind of traumas over and over again, and you get more and more of a healthy relationship with them over time. But these skills really help in this process. Now, discipline and embodiment are great words, but what do they actually mean? What do they mean? So let's have a look into this as well. Now, people take control of the breath and manipulate it in times of stress or adversity, and even hold it as a tool to reduce or mitigate the impact of the stress cascade. That's kind of a natural human thing to do because of our evolutionary biology. Now, most people do this unconsciously, and whilst it may briefly work, it builds up unhealthy patterns of tensional respiratory muscle kind of disorder. It's not the optimal respiratory muscle pattern. And it's therefore not the most useful strategy. And it has issues for how we continue to live life, because then our breathing is constrained or constricted in some way. So we're going to have a look a little bit more at this. People often call on breath practices they may have learned through the internet or on courses, breathwork courses of some kind. But unless you've embodied the practice, and this means truly internalizing it, building it as a core habit in your body's feeling-based intelligence, then calling upon it in the immediacy of the stress cascade will be much harder, if not actually impossible. The idea of resilience is then just that, an idea. Now, as resilience grows through approaching a practice such as breath work or authentic meditative depth or physical training, regularly enough to build it as a habit in the body and mind. And you have to do this habit building regardless of how you feel, regardless of context, regardless of the stories you tell yourself about why you should or shouldn't do it. Resilience grows out of negation. No excuses, no justifications, no blaming, no shaming, and no comparisons. Each moment is unique for each individual. Now, resilience is responsibility in action, and this takes time to learn. and it takes time to learn and embody. Disciplined practice, however, is not beating yourself up. Now, despite the fact of what I said about no excuses and so forth, it's not about beating yourself up, and it's not about ignoring your responsibilities. Say you're a child carer. You're not going to ignore your responsibilities as a child carer to do those practices. You have to find a way to fit them into your life, just like you do with cleaning your teeth. And this is the thing with habits. You clean your teeth and you look after your children. You clean your teeth and you do your job. Another habit is wiping your bum, and everybody's going to do that because it's a habit you've learned. So what we're learning is these habits as a kind of physiological hygiene to keep ourselves well and to keep things working well in the complex world we live in. So we have to make them into healthy habits, which are not about ignoring those responsibilities, but about weaving them in a really good way. All right? And like any other habit, once upon a time you didn't do it, and now you do. And breathwork and meditative depth become like that. Now, just a quick one on meditative depth. Just sitting on your bum for hours on end is not meditative depth. That's sitting on your bum for hours on end, because meditative depth is about the strategies of going in through the structure of your mind, of your brain, and finding a way into what's called foundational awareness. And you're finding that route through. So it's about how you do that, not about how long you sit for. So the skills are just that. They're skills, and you're learning skills. You're not learning to sit for long periods of time just because sitting is supposed to give you something. It doesn't necessarily do that. Okay? Now, life is not fair. Life will challenge you, and you cannot grow resilience in a laboratory. You cannot grow resilience in a soft and fragile environment. Resilience is grown in the real world at the edge of appropriate challenges. Now, trauma sensitivity is all the rage these days, and whilst understanding trauma and how to work with it is critical, hope you heard that, there is now a growing body of work to show that the kind of ultra-trauma sensitivity we see in the well-being world does not allow or even invite resilience. It invites more sensitivity, which isn't necessarily helpful for building resilience. Sensitivity is valuable. Vulnerability is valuable. Vulnerability is precious. Fragility isn't. So if we're going to the edge of sensitivity where we are fragile, that causes trouble. If we're entering into sensitivity and finding increased sensitivity within the structure, but remain centered in ourselves, clear in ourselves, present, alert, and engaged in the world, then that vulnerability and that sensitivity becomes a power. It becomes a tool for resilience. And those are critical differences to understand. Now, if we go into ultra-sensitivity, it crimps, prevents, or destroys the opportunity for resilience. So we need to be really clear about this. I hope that's understandable. This is why I say the edge of appropriate challenge. And the challenge is enough to push you out of your comfort zone, to challenge your resources, maybe even to the maximum, yet it doesn't kill you. It doesn't leave you so psychologically scarred that you can no longer function in the world. Now, George Bonanno worked with people post 9/11. And as he says in his book, which you can read, called The End of Trauma, the majority of people are surprisingly resilient. We need to honour our native resilience and practice growing it. And this is what discipline is for. They have a word for this in authentic yoga speak, and it's tapas, which is not a Spanish meal, by the way. But it actually means creating situations of heat where we're stretching ourselves, almost like a kneeling or going to an alchemical situation where we're creating the heat to allow for change to build that resilience. And that word is tapas. Now, this tapas is an active engagement that we use in our work, in our practices, to take us to those edges internally so that we don't have to just do it in the outside world. Now, of course, tapas has to be done with active restoration. Active restoration is a really, really important part of practice as well. And if you don't do tapas and active restoration, the reality is you're probably just simply stagnating in your privilege. That sounds harsh, but we are super privileged in the modern contemporary world. We have enough food to eat, we have shelter, we have housing, we have electricity. Here I am with screens and cameras and microphones. This is abundance. This is abundance. This is privilege. So what I don't want to do in this is stagnate in this. I want to allow myself the opportunity to meet those edges on a regular basis and keep being challenged, so that I keep finding those edges of resilience where I can grow into an even deeper sense of center, an even deeper sense of equanimity, an even deeper sense of presence with regard to how I am in the world. If we're not doing that, we're not doing it. Now, because the hypothalamus overrides the voluntary control of the breath when survival mechanisms are activated, in times of distress or crisis, you only have access to deeply embedded survival-oriented habits. And if your breath discipline, your mind discipline, meditative practice, and your body discipline has been insubstantial, you won't have access to these tools, these meta skills. So accessing your bio-individual level of skill through personal discipline is critical for living well in modern times and building the kind of resilience we're talking about. We'll look a bit deeper at discipline later. But right now, understanding what your hypothalamus does gives you a kind of superpower. Understanding your brain and how your neurology works gives you a kind of superpower because you can see it in action, you can feel it in action in the world. Now, your hypothalamus is a master regulator, seamlessly networking into multiple regions of the brain. It connects the brainstem, the emotional networks, and the thinking brain. And it's unifying neural and hormonal communication, all the glands of the body as well. It's phenomenal, this tiny little gland, small but mighty. And it sits just behind the eyes at the medial border of the upper brainstem. And it's closely associated with the pituitary gland, forming the neuroendocrine system, which is one unified system of communication within the livingness that you are. It's the neuroendocrine system, the nerves, the brains, and all the endocrine glands which pump hormones into the body and through the body. Now, the neuroendocrine system coordinates what's called the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, and the endocrine system as well, controlling involuntary bodily functions. So everything you don't think about, like temperature, digestion, hunger, thirst, fatigue, it even coordinates sexual activity and defensive reactions such as fear or rage. Now, the side of the ANS that switches on in both arousal and threat situations, that's arousal, ready for action, and also threat, is called the sympathetic nervous system. That's the SNS. And the side that switches on in relaxation, then also in collapse and burnout if we push too fast, is the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS. So the ANS is divided into the arousal side, SNS, and the downregulation side, the PNS. Now, we could talk about polyvagal theory here, but I'm not going to go into that just yet. For those of you who are aficionados or fans of polyvagal theory, which is a great explanatory model, I'm not going to do that just yet. First of all, consider a person in a high-stakes situation, like a firefighter, rescuing somebody from a burning building, or maybe first responders saving lives in a motorway pileup. That's intense. Their hypothalamus is regulating adrenaline release. It's pumping it out there, heightening their focus and reflexes while suppressing non-essential functions like digestion. Now, if the same individuals lacks tools to switch off this stress cascade after the crisis, they'll struggle. They'll struggle with chronic overactivation of the SNS, most likely, and that can then lead to long-term health issues and potential collapse into the less healthy side of the PNS, also known as the dorsal vagal fond, for those of you who are fans of the polyvagal theory. Now, just a very quick word on Porges' model. I like it, it's fantastic, but it doesn't really have much neurobiological basis. But it is a very good way of explaining a little bit more about how we humans operate in the world. Now, the cascade of stress response is initially triggered by a stimulus. Any stimulus that triggers us into a stress response, into that arousal loop, it can loop endlessly if left unchecked. A stimulus could be anything. An external event like a confrontational email, a phone call, a child crying, an argument, or it could be an internal trigger like a body sensation. Maybe you feel something in your belly. Maybe it's an emotion you're really not comfortable with, or maybe it's a cascade of thinking. You're thinking up some really difficult thing about the future. Now, Without proper regulation, these triggers compound, spiraling into narratives of overwhelm and feelings of helplessness. So this is a really complex array of internal events that we're seeking to work well with, which is why understanding what happens is really useful, because understanding gives us a way of regulating things from the top down. And it's why having body-based practices like breathwork practices helps us regulate it from the body up. So we've got top-down and bottom-up practices that we can begin then to work with, to start to work really well with these stress cascades and these complexities. What about people who suffer childhood adversity? Well, people with developmental adversity or overwhelming early life stress often have less effective neural networks to manage these cascades simply because of the impact of those adverse childhood experiences on the brain's growth, on the nervous system growth. Now, just to be clear, we're not talking about the micro traumas of the privileged few here, but the tough stuff. And I'm not saying people who are privileged don't have trauma. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there is, we're not talking about the micro traumas of the privileged few. I'm making distinctions here which I hope are useful. We're talking about the tough stuff that impacts and alters neural function. And it alters it to a degree that their control mechanisms were weakened or never fully developed. That's serious. You can imagine your brain being, the linking mechanisms, the communicative web of the brain, not being developed or grown in a way that allows you optimal function. Now that happens through the influence of cortisol, the long-term stress mediator, because it prevents the myelination, the fat laying down on the nerves in the brain to give you that fast traffic communication. It stops the brain growing properly. It's a kind of developmental brain damage in a way. Now, abuse and neglect are the key aspects of this. We are relational. We grow up in a world of connection and relationship. And if those relationship edges are neglected, our brain doesn't grow as well. And if there's abuse, our brain doesn't grow as well. Imagine a child growing up in a chaotic or kind of abusive home, being neglected maybe and relentlessly ignored. Imagine the neural chaos of uncertainty this creates when sometimes you feel you're loved and sometimes ignored or sometimes abused. It's not surprising when we understand how brains grow that such an individual may lack the neural scaffolding to regulate stress later in life. Of course they would. And of course this then makes them more susceptible to emotional dysregulation, impulsivity and chronic overwhelm. That's going to happen. Now, a huge percentage of people in prison, in mental health and in social services care had high levels of this kind of childhood adversity. So, of course, what we'd be looking at as a society then is ways to help people rehabilitate their brains. That's what would be needed to enable those individuals to be able to operate in a really good way in society, that kind of rehab. This, of course, doesn't always happen. Now, do you know which bit of your brain gives you regulation? It's the prefrontal cortex, right at the front. It's the most recently evolved part of the brain right up here, and it matures around the age of 27. That's right. We actually finish growing our brains around 27 years old. Now, the PFC is a key part of the brain for social engagement, for decision-making and self-regulation. It's a hub for emotional and cognitive networks, long-term memory, and sensory inputs as well. And all of these pieces, because it plays a central role in planning, decision-making, and top-down regulation, our ability to consciously manage our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviours only really comes on when we're about 27. And it's the part we think of as making informed choice. Now, two key regions of the prefrontal cortex are particularly important for us to consider when we're thinking about breath work and the impact of these kind of practices. One's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is in the front and the middle. Ventromedial means front and middle. And it just above the brow here. And it connects with emotional networks like the amygdala, which is the brain's fear watchdog. It does many things, but it's a key part of the emotional network. And the nucleus accumbens, which is a part of the brain which processes motivation, reward, and aversion. Now, this area, the VMPFC, is highly active in decision-making. And it's highly active in emotional regulation. It's helping us to manage the arising flow of emotions and then potentially give us choices how to respond to an emotion that's arising through the system. And of course, if the brain hasn't developed so that communication isn't effective, we will just react to those emotions rather than take some time to reflect and work out what might be the best strategy. It gives you the opportunity to either approach or avoid a situation based on past experiences, for example. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex is an important part of the self-regulation system. Another part is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is situated on both sides of the PFC. And this integrates sensory information and motor responses. So it's linking perception to action. It's critical for working memory and reality testing, helping you ask, is the situation really what it appears? Is it really as threatening as this? Is it going to give me the thing I think it's going to give me? So it's that kind of reality testing hub. For example, imagine being in a crowded subway when somebody accidentally bumps into you. The DLPFC allows you to pause for a moment and assess the situation instead of reacting impulsively. And you might say, oh, no problem, excuse me. Or you might lash out. And that emotional reaction of the lashing out, of course, is a process that has not been through the ventromedial PFC linking to the dorsolateral PFC and giving you that moment. And that occurs mostly because of that lack of neural integration that occurs in the developmental journey through childhood and adolescence up to the age of 27. We haven't grown the brain in the most effective way. Together, these two areas create a dynamic balance, regulating behavior and facilitating choice making. But stress, immediate stress now, and a history of developmental stress disrupts this balance. When the amygdala, the fear watchdog, hijacks the system, the PFC's top-down regulation diminishes. Your focus narrows, habitual responses dominate, and decision-making becomes reactionary. It's as if the thinking brain hands over to the reins to the survival brain. It's kind of exactly what happens, in fact. Now, just an aside for a moment, but think about this. One of the reasons the billionaire barons, the oligarchs of the social media, keep drip-feeding the kind of fear porn of doom scrolling so successfully is that so that most people are living in this kind of slight soup of habitual reactivity, the existential fear of nuclear war, the existential fear of being murdered on the street, the existential fear of losing all their money, the existential fear of stepping out of your house, of talking to strangers, of meeting anyone, of living your life, of cancer, of dying young, all the stuff that's pumped through the fear porn media. That keeps us in this reactive state. And in that reactive state, we live according to the reactionary habits with which we're familiar, and we are highly controllable, like frightened sheep. In this situation, parts of our brain, like the amygdala and the insula, kick in, and we look back to the golden age when everything was great. Yes, it was all good back then. Was it really? And we get scared of people who look different, who eat different, who behave different. We see other people as disgusting because they're different. So we start to create kinds of people. They are the kind of people that do this. They are the kind of people that do that. Are they really? Or your brain creating that? So your brain creates kinds of people. And it creates those kinds of people and objectifies them, turns them into objects where they are slightly less than human. Those people that eat dogs, for example, over in Springfield, in the USA. Really? Do they? So when everything was great, we look back to times when everything was great. We get scared of people who look different. We get controlled by our emotions, fear and habitual patterns. Why is the news not full of the awesome, fantastic, amazing things people are doing across the planet, like this podcast? Because you can't be controlled like that. If you want to free yourself from the fear porn, doom scrolling control, you have to start thinking about how you work with your mobile phone. And of course, the mobile phone itself has been designed to keep you scrolling, to keep the infinite scroll of that, because that kicks into your dopamine systems, which link with the middle part of the dopamine web to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, And it gives you that immediate gratification of the next lovely picture or the next thing you found or the thing that you can share or like and so on. So these mobile phones, and I'm filming on one now, these mobile phones are a powerful tool, and they also are highly complicated in terms of how they interface with brain function. And again, we are being controlled by them. So we need to pay attention, and the way we can pay attention and look after ourselves is understand how this works so that we can have practices where we have an interface between us and the fear, between us and the media content, so that we can look after our biology and not be controlled by that which is being pushed at us. Hopefully that makes sense. And the thing about us human beings is that whilst we're naturally resilient, we're also sensitive. And you know, actually, even mild, uncontrolled stress that isn't resolved can impair the prefrontal cortex. And under prolonged stress, we see structural changes occurring where the amygdala, the fear watchdog, grows and the hippocampus, key to memory and learning, becomes overactive and the prefrontal cortex weakens. We have less capacity to make informed choices. All of this leads to impaired memory consolidation, reduced empathy, which is really important. We're less human, if you like. We don't interrelate with each other in such an empathic way. And we have diminished capacity for reflective decision making. And now in extreme cases, this is what underpins conditions like learned helplessness. The sense that no action can change the situation. Now, according to medical stats, upwards of 70%, and we're looking at something like nearly 80% actually, of modern human populations live in this kind of stressed out state. And then no wonder we can be controlled by the doom and fear porn, billionaire oligarchical media barons and their agendas. Of course we can, because our nervous systems are running in that condition. Now just imagine an office worker juggling multiple deadlines while managing family conflicts. Over time, their stress leads to sleepless nights. It's a natural outcome of that. It then leads to irritability and impaired focus, reduced empathy in the family, reduced care for each other. And without intervention, this individual risks falling into chronic overwhelm. And of course, that impacts the whole family. Now, where the amygdala dominates and the PFC loses its capacity to regulate effectively, we run into trouble. So having the skills to keep our PFC online and to keep our regulation in place is absolutely critical in the modern age. Now, the good thing is, fortunately, we've talked about neuroplasticity, the way the brain can rewire itself. Fortunately, the PFC can be strengthened, even in adulthood. And it can be done through deliberate practices that enhance top-down regulation and bottom-up regulation, systematic step-by-step breath work, working from the base of functional breathing, and that's really important. Systematic, step-by-step, working from the base of functional breathing is one such practice. There are others, of course. But breathwork is not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything. It's not going to do that. Regardless of how some breathwork is presented, it's not going to do that. Breathwork is one tool in a tool bag of practices that we need to live well. Regular, systematic, intentional breathwork like this can condition the prefrontal cortex to maintain control during stress. You train your prefrontal cortex to stay on, and you can actually tune down the amygdala's reactivity and power and build neural resilience in this way. It's a really powerful skill set. It's a superpower. This breathwork practice is thousands of years old from the Asian yogic traditions. Now, the challenge of it is that it comes across as really boring to begin with, until you get into it and when you realize the vibrancy and the beauty and the nuances of it, in which case it becomes amazing. But to get into it, it takes real discipline. And again, the upside of it as well is that it also helps your dopamine threshold. It helps you regulate your dopamine threshold. So if you have been scrolling on the phone too much or you've been working on screens a lot, it gives you the capacity to re-regulate your dopaminergic systems and reset your threshold so that you don't keep getting addicted to that need to scroll. In a neurobiological way, it's kind of like connecting your brainstem with your prefrontal cortex and getting that loop working really well. And also you're getting a metric on your basic metabolic function, because tuning into the breath, of course, is a basic metabolic function. And it gives you this capacity, really listening into this aspect of our biology. Now, breath is connected to how you think, feel, and move. So tuning into the breath like this and just feeling what's happening over time is a superpower. Now, not only that, it's been used in these Asian yogic traditions as one of the key preparatory practices for waking up to the nature of who and what we are, waking up to the nature of reality. Pretty awesome. But you're going to need discipline or it goes nowhere fast. You need discipline. Now, the other thing we know about this practice is it actually helps to build neural bridges between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So it is like having a superpower to keep your PFC switched on in times of complexity. But you have to do it on a regular basis because you're working with these ancient biological algorithms. And by that, what I mean is, the enteric nervous system, the gut brain, which has a lot of informational content in it, which flows up to the brain, up through the brainstem into the brain. All that information from the gut brain, that is 500 million years old. 500 million years old. The brainstem function is 350 million years old. This recently evolved bit of the brain here is 200,000 years old. It's new. It's a little baby in comparison to the other algorithmic structures of the brainstem that are running basic survival. This is very, very new. So if we're going to work well with this new bit, we have to work well with the rest of it. So a lot of the practices I do are working well, for example, with the enteric nervous system or with the brainstem. And this capacity for tuning into breathing gives us an angle, an edge, a way into that basic function. So awareness of breathing is very, very simple. What it is you sit down, reduce movement. You can't do it to begin with. You can't do it as a beginner if you're moving because there's too much other information going up to the brain. So you sit still for a while, and 15 minutes is more than enough. 5 minutes is a good beginning. And you sit still, you reduce visual information into your brain, with primarily visual, so you just close your eyes or half close them. It's fine either way. And that reduction of visual information gives you then the beginnings of access into what else is going on. Now, of course, when we start to then tune into the breath, and the breath is nasal, and ideally down into the belly, if somebody's doing reverse breathing, where they're breathing oral and into the upper chest, what we need to do first is recreate a situation of functional breathing. So we need some retraining to get the breath nasal and abdominal. And that piece of the puzzle has to be done. And you can find stuff on my YouTube channel on this as well, by the way. If you look down other things, you'll find reverse breathing. But right now, breath is nasal, abdominal, low and slow. Just tuning into the breath. All you're doing is sustaining your attentional focus on the breath, what the breathing is like. Maybe you feel the breathing muscles. Maybe you feel the movement of the belly. Maybe you feel the flow of the air through the nose. And the whole time you're staying fully present in the body. And you catch yourself. One of the other names for this practice is noticing and returning, because you catch yourself wandering off thinking about, where you're going shopping or what you're going to have for dinner or what somebody said to you yesterday or what might happen tomorrow. So you're noticing those movements of mind and bringing it back to the breath and constantly noticing and then returning back to the breath. Noticing the movements of mind, returning back to the breath. And over time you develop a really good skill set of doing this. And it's in that noticing and returning that these neural bridges grow, that you begin to get more familiar with brainstem function, and it gives you this superpower of starting to learn to switch the prefrontal cortex on in times of duress. You're building power habits into your life. Now, consider an athlete. Consider an athlete practicing aware, so that's fully aware of the breath, nasal, low, it's coming down to the belly, and slow breathing. And this is the cue. I'll say this again because it's such a good, important thing. Aware is key. Nasal is key. Low, down to the abdomen, and slow. That's 4 pieces. Aware, nasal, low, and slow breathing. Imagine doing that before a competition. It not only calms the nerves, but it also trains their prefrontal cortex to remain engaged during those high-stakes moments. Now, over times, these practices cultivate a buffer against stress, enabling more thoughtful, considered, informed responses, even in the most challenging of situations. Now again, this is work in practice. We can't expect to do this immediately. All of these things are a lifetime's work. And of course, if we've had a history of childhood adversity, it's going to make it more demanding. More support, more help is needed. By the way, another powerful and brilliant practice to calm down and down-regulate the brain, that's to bring yourself into a place of greater neural calm, is biphasic inhale with a slow exhale. So what that simply means, biphasic means you're taking two phases. So the first part is what we said, aware, nasal, low and slow, down into the belly, first part of the breath, pause for a moment. And then get the second part of the breath where you breathe into the lower ribs, ribs 6 to 10 down here, both into the back of the body and the front. It's front side, back, back side, front, getting the whole of the rib structures open there. And that's two parts of the inhale. And then just breathe out very slowly. Slowly as is comfortable for you. Make sure the following inhale is clear and calm and easy, effortless, no air hunger, no stress. So that's a biphasic inhale. Aware, nasal, low and slow. Then into the ribs. Long exhale. And just repeat. And that's going to help you down-regulate your system. So that's another skill to take away. And again, if you don't have that habit in place, if you don't build it into your life as a habit, when the proverbial does hit the fan, you're not going to have access to it. It's not a habit. You can't have it. It's just an idea. So this is one of the reasons why disciplined practice is so needed. Now, I play with lots of variants of this, and I promise you that, I've had to put them into practice. Now, breathwork isn't just a technique or a wellness fad. It's an embodiment practice that you have to make bio-individual for you. You have to make it work for you. Now, to rely on it effectively in the heat of the moment, like I said, it's got to be deeply ingrained. And this means consistent training. So the neural pathways are readily available when the stress strikes. Now, just think of a martial artist. It's like a martial artist drills movement, block, yes? Block, outward block, outward block, outward block, yeah? Notice outward block, upward block. You're working with a martial artist drills their movement until they become second nature. Now, breath work has to become automatic like that, yeah? So it's fully aware still. The movement is aware, but it's automatic. And it has to be like that to be effective in the immediacy of a stress cascade. We must have disciplined practice for it to be effective. Behavior is the expression of our internal processes. It's how those internal processes move into the world. It's how we react or respond to stimuli, life events or inner sensations, and how those actions impact the world around us. Now, when we're under the influence of a stress cascade, our behaviours are often, to say the least, reflexive reactions rather than informed responses. We fall back into those automatic patterns shaped by our ancestral inheritance, personal experiences, cultural norms, and developmental conditioning. These reactive patterns then lack awareness, and while they may appear as choices, they're more accurately preconditioned responses hardwired into our neural circuitry. Now, renowned neuroscience, who I have great respect for, Robert Sapolsky, in his book, which I highly recommend you read, called Determined, challenges the notion of free will, explaining that what we perceive as choice is simply the result of conditioned neural events set into motion long before conscious awareness. While this perspective may feel disempowering, it opens a critical doorway, the potential to what I call free won't. Because if we can interrupt those patterns and pause for a moment and understand, right, that all those things are driving us from our ancestry, from our cultural conditioning, from our personal background, all that is driving us, our biological elements, all pushing us into this moment of reactivity. If we have that prefrontal cortical power, which we've built in to our biology in that way, we have a moment to be able to say, no, I'm not doing that. Now, within that second, we also have to ask ourselves, what else could be possible? So there's a no to the driving patterns in us, a moment of pause, and then what else could be possible? Now, It doesn't mean that what you're going to choose is going to be the right thing. It doesn't mean anything of the kind, but it does mean that you're interrupting the patterns and you're cultivating those skills of pattern interruption with the option of a new possibility arising. So that's what I call the free won't, which cultivates spaciousness for informed reflective responses. And as one trains in this, you get better and better at it over time. So by the time you're 70, 60, 50, depends what's happened in your life, 40, whenever, I'm being a little bit cynical there. It's a 10-year practice to cultivate this, of course. It takes time. It takes discipline. So let's have a quick look at reaction versus response and why it matters. Now, what are reactions? Reactions include withdrawing from relationships or situations. Of course, sometimes that's the right thing to do. But, that sort of kind of habitual withdrawal is problematic. Making poor short-term decisions is another one. Now, we all do it from time to time. It's not a criticism. It's not a critique. It's recognizing that it's a reaction. Engaging in protective reflexes like anger, aggression, avoidance, fawning, making friends with people who aren't our friends, all the kind of things that we do to try and protect ourselves and look after ourselves, as well as falling into anxiety, depression, or neglectful self-care. All of these are kind of reactions to what's happening to us. Responses, on the other hand, require heightened awareness, a kind of capacity to pause and reflect before acting. And they require interrupting the cascade of reactivity, like I said, by asking, what else is possible? What am I not seeing? What do I feel right now? What does my body say? What is unknown to me? What else is there? This kind of intentional pause creates room for more adaptive, resourceful, and mindful behavior. And it's the foundation for liberating oneself from ingrained patterns and biases, including the relentless pull towards confirming pre-existing beliefs, which we humans love so well, the kind of bias confirmation that we do. And that does feel like a relentless pull. Our beliefs, our story, our biases have to be confirmed. So we look for that confirmation. Of course, we find it. And that's, again, how social media works, because it takes us into these vortexes of polarizing where we become right based on the information the algorithms are giving us. And we can no longer see what somebody else is seeing because they're going down different algorithmic rabbit holes. The thing is, you see, that interrupting these habitual loops is where true growth begins. This is the beginning of true growth, and it's the beginning of awakening to what's real. If we're just going down rabbit holes of bias confirmation, that's not waking up. It's not awakening. It's just doing the same old, same old, same old in the same old kind of way to a deeper level. Now, a key pattern interrupt breath practice, and you use aware ANLS breath, that's aware nasal low and slow breath as part of it. So the stop, and again, I'll go deeper into it, because if you know deep yoga or internal family systems model, we can add in another aspect to it. But at its basic level, it's stop, S-T-O-P. With deep yoga, or internal family systems, it's S-T-O-R-P. S stands for stop. You're catching yourself doing the pattern. You're reacting. You're catching the reaction. Stop for a moment. T stands for take some breaths. Take some aware, nasal, low and slow breaths. Maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 9. But take those breaths. O is observe. Observe the reactivity. Observe your body. Observe the situation. And then make a choice. What are you not seeing? What else is there? And then proceed from there. It doesn't mean it's always going to be right, but you're learning to interrupt those patterns. Now, let's be clear. Every single choice you make, every single choice I make has consequences, and we cannot see all the consequences in advance. So what we tend to do is to look back on a choice we've made and think, that was a terrible choice and I wish I hadn't made it, but that was the choice we made given the information we had at the time. And if we'd had more information, we might have made a different choice, but we didn't, so we couldn't. So there's no point in going back and blaming ourselves. Remember, we're not blaming either ourselves or anyone else. That's not helpful, and we're not shaming, and we're not excusing or justifying either. What we're doing is seeing those patterns and then paying attention. We're stopping, we're observing, and proceeding. but we don't know the consequences of that choice. We can't know that, not in full. So we have to make that choice and proceed in good faith. And that's kind of what we're doing. STOP, stop, take the breaths, observe, proceed. Now, if you know internal family systems model, you know about firefighters and managers and exiles and your true self, or the yoga model, which has the true self as a core identity, whether it's Buddha nature or self as in Satchitananda in a yoga world. Then what you do is stop. Stop in the reactivity. Pause. Take those aware nasal low slow breaths. Observe your body. Observe the patterns that are moving through you. Remember your true self. Remember your true self. Now you can talk from the parts that are exiled, managing or firefighting, but you've got to remember your true self and then proceed from there. What does your true self say? What feels true and real from that foundational awareness that we talked about earlier on? Now, this is powerful stuff. This is really powerful stuff because it's the mechanics of freedom. And without this kind of mechanism, you'll just be acting out those bioalgorithms, the reactive habits, the distress parts and the cultural conditioning. If you want real freedom, there's a price to pay. What's the price of real freedom? It's discipline. Discipline is the price for freedom. One of the things I want to bring into the puzzle here of stress is blood gases and stress, which is also the breath connection. Understanding the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood is crucial for managing the physiological impacts of stress. Because when we get stressed, we tend to revert to slightly oral, upper chest breathing, which pumps carbon dioxide out the blood. And when we pump carbon dioxide out the blood through rapid, shallow breathing, what the oxygen, Vajra, Buteyko systems call overbreathing, that reduction in carbon dioxide stops oxygen getting from the red blood cells into the brain and into the cells. So we're actually creating a suboptimal respiratory situation where our energy producing mechanisms are not getting enough oxygen to do what they need. And that kind of hyperventilation, which is another word for it, overbreathing or hyperventilation, that perpetuates the stress cascade by signaling a threat to the body, even when there's no immediate danger present. So this physiology is really important. Not only that, but we have loads of receptors in the brain, which are receptors for carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, which come from breakdown of the carbon dioxide in the blood. So those ion receptors that will activate the amygdala if we go into those kind of situations. So we're getting again into this stress-based pattern simply from breathing in a poor way. Now, systematic breath-based practices can reverse this cycle. They can stop it and turn it around. And again, one of the key things is aware, nasal, low and slow breath. Because aware, nasal, low and slow breath will tend to turn that pattern around. And you can turn it around in 3 breaths. It can be very, very fast because the systems are very fast in their responsivity. So when we're working with something like that, we need to down-regulate first. Down-regulation means calming the neuroendocrine system. So calming, parasympathetic, that's relaxation-oriented practices, gentle rhythmic breathing, with a focus on extending the exhale like we did the biphasic inhale and the long exhale. Practices like that, or rhythmic practices of 5 or 6 second inhale, 5 or 6 second exhale, all those kind of practices help settle the nervous system. We can then go into a gradual progression where we introduce breath holding or retentions. And again, it has to be done cautiously, always monitoring physiological responses. And this can gradually build tolerance and resilience within the system. And of course, what's really important is we personalize our practice. We tailor the breath work to our individual needs. And of course, to begin with, most people need guidance on that in terms of how to do that well. Not everybody, but most people do. And particularly for those people with health conditions like hypertension or cardiac issues, it's probably important to work with a highly qualified practitioner, somebody who really understands physiology, who really understands medicine in that way. Now, for example, you'd avoid excessive breath holds or hyperventilation techniques and prioritize, slow nasal breathing for somebody with those kind of conditions. But there's a lot to pay attention to here as you individualize your practices. But that's the intention, is to go into that place over time and build that. Now, of course, the traditions from Asia have been working with this for thousands of years. A breathwork practitioner and a breathwork instructor in the Asian traditions would work with their teacher for 12 years before they taught. And they only taught when they were told by their teacher they were ready to teach. Now, of course, these days you can become a breathwork instructor in a week, a short 8-month course or something like that, without any prior training in science, without any prior training in physiology, without any prior training in personal practice of any kind. And yet you can still become a breathwork practitioner very rapidly. So having the difference of understanding between understanding what's happening in the Western world and the Asian traditions, where somebody had to practice for a minimum of 12 years before they even began teaching, and sometimes it's longer than that, 20 years. You can see the radical differences in embodiment of the practices that can occur. So in the Western world, we have people teaching without any embodied, individualized practices. They're just teaching ideas, basically. And then from the Asian tradition, we have people with deeply embodied, deeply individualized practices, which they've done for decades, who are then communicating that clearly and effectively to their students. So those very big differences. And at the moment, we're in that place where, of course, money comes into it. Capitalism has a place to play in this because this can be monetized. It's much harder to monetize something which takes many, many, many decades or many years to build. So capitalism has a role to play here. But again, these breathwork practices, they have to be done well and they have to be individualized, and you have to cultivate discipline, as I've explained, or they just don't work. Not effectively, not really. So hormesis is working at these edges. We're using physiological challenges to build resilience in the system. And again, when we're doing this, we begin low and we go slow. Gradual exposure to stronger breathwork techniques ensures the body adapts without being overwhelmed. A lot of people go into very strong breathwork practices, something like conscious connected breathing, for example, when they are physiologically challenged already, when their cells are already stressed. And what they're doing then is adding on another level of stress, because they're, with that kind of breathing style, the hyperventilatory breathing styles, what we're doing is reducing oxygen into the cells. And if that's on top of already challenged cells that may be, insulin insensitive or something like that, pre-diabetic, then what we're going to get is a more challenged system. It's not working effectively with hormesis. So we begin low and we go slow. So that requires titration of practices. It requires a gradual exposure to breathwork techniques, building up from the base of functional breathing, building up from the base of down regulation. And that allows the body to adapt without being overwhelmed. Tracking progress is really important as well. If you're going to start doing daily practice, you need to know, with journaling or biofeedback tools to monitor physiological responses and help you refine the practices. That's another really useful strategy. And of course, understanding the yin and the yang of the practices, alternating between calming and more intense practices, making sure that you know how to regulate and return to balance. But the thing is that when you practice well over many, many years of practice, remember, you're training your brain, you're training your PFC to stay on, you're giving yourself these superpowers through the practice. So it's an amazing thing to do. So what is the path forward? Now, I think if we think of how we can explore how in training new behaviors, harnessing hormesis and cultivating free won't can help us liberate ourselves and then other individuals, and then liberate our cultures and our communities from the GIP, the stress cascade, and the fear merchants. Remember what fear does to the system. Remember what stress does to the system. So what we're seeking to do is liberate our biology from that kind of control. And remember, these practices are not about returning to an illusory sense of free will. but about creating awareness and space for free won't. What else is possible? For informed, skillful responses, and then learning over time what those skillful responses are. Like I said, we all make mistakes. We're always going to mess it up a little bit. We know we're messy human beings. That's the way it is. And that's perfectly okay, because what you're doing is learning over time. Sorry I messed up there. Great. Get back on it. Do it again. Right? Try not to make the same mistake twice. That's all it is. It's simple. It's continuous, ongoing training. But these skills give you access to that free won't. Now, by training the breath and the body to respond rather than react, we unlock profound capacities for resilience, adaptability, and connection. A new paradigm for engaging with stress is rising, and it's necessary for us to thrive in the complex modern world, which is volatile, uncertain, chaotic, ambiguous, and carries with it the existential threat of, of climate change, of nuclear war, and all the rest of what's going on. So we have to be able to face in that well if we're going to thrive in this. So let's continue this journey with an open mind, a curious heart, and an evolving awareness of what might yet be possible. What is possible? What else is there? What are we not seeing? What else can we consider? Yeah? Do we just look for bias confirmation and diving down to a rabbit hole of our own certainty, or do we stay open and curious? It's a good question. Now, we've looked at 4 breath-based skills you can take away. Now, I have a lot more that you can learn if you're interested. Of course, there's quite a lot of stuff on the YouTube channel here. But if you go to my website, there's some free courses up there. I've done 46 practices, I think, on the first one. It's all freely available. You can go up there and access that, and you can take those out into the world in a good way. So get those skills, start working with them. If you want more input from me, if you want to work with me in a disciplined way, then get in touch with me, DM me. All right? Now, mind-based skills are also important. Understanding how this works, which we're talking about here, how to work well with it. And we've started to look at the mind-based skill of free won't. No, I'm not choosing this. What else is possible? What am I not seeing? Etc. These kind of skills open the gates of perception. Rather than shutting them down into bias confirmation, this opens the gates of perception. All mind-based skills eventually come down to a shift in perception. We're enlarging our perceptual possibilities. When we're 2 years old, maybe a spider or a barking puppy dog can be terrifying. As we grow older, there's a possibility of a shift in perspective where we see that spider as a curious and interesting little creature that we want to know more about, or the puppy dog is a beautiful little puppy dog. It's not terrifying at all. These shifts in perspective, are important because they're our brain rewiring itself. It's neuroplastic experience. So what we're doing with the practices is self-applied neuroplasticity. I'll say that again, self-applied neuroplasticity. And of course, that's a whole skill set. Meditative mind training, where we relax in presence through the web of synaptic possibilities so that we find a state of embodied foundational awareness that we've talked about, is powerful because it's out of this foundational awareness that all emoting and all thinking emerges. And this offers a radical shift in perspective because it means we no longer identify with thought or emotion. There's an experience of spaciousness where both thought and emotion are seen for what they are. They're data. They're information about relationship, internal and external. And from this spacious perspective of embodied foundational awareness, free won't becomes much more effortlessly available. Resilience becomes who you are. Now, breath-based skills are profound, and in many ways they're an entry-level practice. That's right. They're an entry-level practice for the profound mind-based skills that lead to the kind of perspectival shifts that radically transform life that we're talking about, this accessing through the synaptic web, this foundational awareness. So take a breath. Take an aware, nasal, low and slow breath, and relax into this delicious soup of information. Relax into it. Hopefully, you've heard the importance of disciplined practice, bio-individual practice, disciplined practice, as a means to train the informational web the data web of the biological algorithms of who and what we are, the web of neural connection, of neuroendocrine relationship within us. We're training all of that to find this foundational awareness within us and create those perspectival shifts. Discipline is key. The price of freedom is discipline. Now, there's a lot of depth here, and you can, of course, go through this as often as you want to extract the goodies. And, of course, if you want much more, and if you want to work one-to-one with me, then please get in touch. Get in touch with me. So, have a beautiful day. And otherwise, that's it from me, from Embody, the show where we look at living well through mastering body, breath, and mind. And that's it from me now, your host, Christopher G. Spread the word of what you've heard. And please, be well, breathe well, be happy.